Hey guys, Caleb here with DSLR Video Shooter, and today we're talking about the Panasonic S1 and why I think a lot of people are wrong about this new camera. So first of all, this is a GH5, not a Panasonic S1. This video is not sponsored, but I have done a series of these videos talking about, different cameras and kind of reacting to the initial reactions people have toward these. So first and foremost, there are a list of things I'm hearing people say online about the Panasonic S1. It's too big, it's too expensive, the lenses are dumb and suck, the autofocus sucks, and the video specs are weak. And I kind of want to address some of those things and maybe bring some fresh perspective here on YouTube when it comes to this new camera. And I want to start by talking about the GH5 and GH5S. I think it's wrong to compare this new camera to those cameras. They're completely different and there's not a lot of crossover when it comes to the physical mechanics and electronics of both of those. So I'm shooting this on the GH5S, this is the GH5, both great cameras, and I see a lot of people comparing them to this new Panasonic S1, and you just really can't do that. These are micro four thirds sensors. They're tiny compared to 35 millimeter. So the tech involved in stabilizing a larger sensor, heat dissipation on a larger sensor, and processors, data, information pulling off of something like that, powering that sensor, it's all different. So I would encourage you not to say, hey, the GH5 can shoot up to 400 megabits a second. Why can't the S1? They're just completely different, and it's really difficult to just copy and paste, features of a tiny sensor camera like this to a full frame. One of the big things people are complaining about with the S1 is the specs and feeling like it's kind of crippled compared to the GH5 and GH5S. At launch, the S1 is going to be able to shoot up to 60 frames per second at 4K. That will be 420 long GOP at 150 megabits a second, and there will be a 1.5 times crop, and there will be a 15-minute record limit, and if it's hot out, it's going to be shorter. When it comes to 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second, you can shoot at 4K, again, long GOP at 100 megabits a second, 420 8-bit, and that's pretty much going to be the rest of the settings on that camera, that 420 8-bit at 100 megabits a second. When it comes to the HDMI output of the S1, we're looking at up to 60 frames per second, 420 8-bit out, and then when it comes to 24 and 30 frames per second, you're looking at 422 8-bit out. So a little better when it comes to the output on the HDMI. And then at some point in the future, we don't know when, Panasonic will be releasing a firmware update that you'll have to pay for, but that'll unlock some new features on the camera, including internal 4K at 150 megabits a second, and that'll give you up to 30 frames per second in 422 10-bit. So now we're up in that nice, happy video land. And then the output will give you up to 60 frames per second, 422 10-bit as well. So that's where you'll start to really see those video specs get a nice bump. We'll also get Vlog, not Vlog L, but full Monty Vlog out of the camera. And that's going to give you, according to Panasonic, up to 14.5 stops, which is going to be pretty sweet. Last but not least, I'll also mention that you can record up to 180 frames per second in HD on the camera, but it remains to be seen what the quality is fully going to look like on that. Whew. So those are the video specs. In my opinion, it's actually pretty good for full frame. If we take a look in Sony land at the A7 III, you're capped at 100 megabits a second, and I believe that's a 420 8-bit as well. So when the update comes for the Panasonic S1, it's going to be pretty far ahead of what Sony's got going on. So I think for a full frame camera, those specs are pretty great. And I don't know if Panasonic could do much better given, again, the amount of heat coming out of that thing. And I think that's why it's a larger camera. Those who were complaining about the size, well, to do the image stabilization like they're going to have in that camera and those video specs we just talked about, that's a lot of heat. So to keep things from overheating, they went with a larger body, and I appreciate that. Before we jump into autofocus, I want to talk about RAW. Now, Panasonic has not confirmed that there will be any kind of RAW output on this camera. Panasonic has said that they've maybe not necessarily talked, but they are aware of Adamus and what's going on with ProRes RAW. So we could see that happen down the road. I saw that with two different sources, both with CVP. They did a video where they mentioned Panasonic and RAW, And then finally, EOS HD actually interviewed one of the Panasonic people, and they mentioned that they've worked closely with Adamus, and we might see something there. I would not be surprised if they go that route, given what Nikon's up to. If they included RAW in the S1, or at least output to an HDMI recorder, I think that could be a pretty solid, strong move to go up against Nikon. Now let's jump into autofocus. This is going to be one where you'll see a lot of flack given to Panasonic online when it comes to the S1. Now, I want to start by saying I don't think this camera will ever be as good as necessarily what Sony's got going on. I switched cameras, now we're looking at the A7 III, or Canon with their dual pixel autofocus. It might get close, but I don't think we're ever gonna see that, beat that system. In this camera system, the S1, there's a couple other things to keep in mind. Number one, all the footage we've seen so far online has all been pre-production stuff, and it looks like it's a really, really early pre-production firmware on those cameras. So there's been people talking about the reviews they're seeing, and they're saying the autofocus looks terrible, and it absolutely does. I don't think that's what the final camera is going to look like. The next thing that's really, really important to keep in mind is that Panasonic especially does an amazing job releasing firmware updates down the road. If you look at autofocus on the GH5S, GH5 at launch compared to now, they're like completely new cameras. So I would completely expect the same from the S1. And also, and this is really important, Panasonic has always done a really good job with their processors, both them and Sony, especially compared to Canon. So you've got a lot of horsepower when it comes to the hardware, and over time the software is just going to improve and maximize the use of that hardware. So Panasonic, while they have decided to stick with contrast based autofocus, we could expect to see that improve significantly, because even if the technology maybe isn't the best for acquiring autofocus or doing it quickly, that could get really close to perfect given the AI, which is in that camera, and the new processor. So I would not say this camera is going to suck from out of the gate until it's a dead camera. It's going to improve over time. So I don't think there's, too much hope to be lost there. Also, it should be noted that, contrast-based autofocus is actually not terrible depending on how you look at it. I would highly recommend Gerald Undun's video recently that he did on autofocus systems. Definitely check that out. He talks about the pros and cons of each style from each manufacturer, and he's got some really interesting things to say about contrast-based autofocus. Now let's talk about maybe one of the biggest, if not the biggest issue people have with the S1, and that is lenses. They are so expensive. A 50mm f1.4 shouldn't cost over $2,000, yet that's what Panasonic is going with for their first 50mm. And then if you're researching alternatives, you're going to come across the Leica L mount or SL lenses, and those are so expensive, it's ridiculous. So not a lot of good options right now, but that's definitely going to change because of Sigma. Right? So we've got Sigma making L lenses. They're in that alliance with Leica and Panasonic. I would definitely expect to see some really nice affordable lenses from them. I'm really excited to see what Sigma does. And the other great thing about the L mount is the adapters, or at least the ability to add adapters, so you can use pretty much any lens on the planet with that mount. It's going to be a great mount for adapting lenses. So I'm not worried too much about lenses. It's very tough here at the beginning, and it was really painful to drop, $3,500 for a kit lens and the body when I pre-ordered mine. Hoping that gets better over time. And now I want to wrap up with all the other little odds and ends. A very important thing to take a look at and pay attention to on this new camera is going to be the in-body stabilization. Like the GH5, I expect this camera to be pretty impressive. Maybe not quite as good given how small that micro four thirds sensor is on the GH5, but because of the body size of the S1, I would expect Panasonic to do some pretty impressive things. Next up, we have a new battery, which I'm really glad to see. They're not going to stretch the original battery from the GH5 5S. And then another really awesome thing is you'll be able to use the XLR audio adapter, which I love using on GH cameras, and you'll be able to use that directly with the S1. So that really helps those filmmaker documentary style shooters get a nice little cinema package or documentary package using that XLR adapter. Low light is looking pretty good on this camera, but it's, you know, maybe not going to quite keep up with Sony. And finally, there is the lack of a flip out screen. Nobody's wrong for trashing Panasonic for this. Please stop doing this, guys. Come on. So in conclusion, I'm really excited for this camera. I've loved the GH5 and GH5S, and I'm willing to give this one a shot. Is it going to be autofocus level of awesome like the A7 III or some of Canon's offerings? Probably not. It probably and maybe never get to that point using the tech that Panasonic's going with at this time. But I think image quality is where this camera is going to shine. I'm pretty confident in saying that I think this is going to be the best full frame camera for shooting video under $5,000 until we see whatever Sony's going to do whenever they come out with the A7S III. And that's going to be the camera to watch out for if you're shopping for full frame. I'm pretty sure that's going to be significantly more expensive than the Panasonic S series, but that remains to be seen. So at this point, really all the balls are in Sony's court. I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens when it comes to high quality, spec loaded full frame cameras. And that's going to wrap this one up. I know it was a long one. Thank you for sticking in there with me. And stay tuned for more camera reviews and S1 coverage whenever that camera ships and whenever we get it here in the studio. Quick side note, I just want to say if you enjoy these videos and want to support me as a filmmaker and content creator, definitely check out my camera guides. I just released one for the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, and if you're interested in that camera or any other camera, check out the Academy. You might find something you're interested in over there. That's going to do it for me, guys. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next video.